So, again, we are thrilled to have you, happy to celebrate, happy to be joined by music, but most of all, by you. Contrary to the way the program looks, Kara Brooke and I are not the keynote speaker. You have come here to hear David Brooks, and that's going to happen shortly. We're very, very excited. I'm Nancy Zimfer, and I should say Nancy Lusk Zimfer. That's my name when I grew up in Gallipolis and Gallia County. And happy to be here representing the Foundation for Appalachian Ohio. I had a discussion at my table about Appalachian. I'm working on it. I don't know which is right, but people have strong opinions, and you know that. We have a number of our board members here this evening, and their names should be along the screen, and we couldn't do this work without our board, so I want to thank each and every one of you. Earlier this evening, we had a wonderful opportunity to celebrate a new program, a pilot program with the Foundation for Appalachian Ohio called the Growing Home Fellows. These are 120 of our best and brightest 22 to 35-year-olds who live here, who work here, who care here, and for whom the foundation is supporting over the next 5 years a project that they will be designing in their own local community to do what they do best, to do what David Brooks talks about, and to be with their community in work and in spirit. So some may meet a few of them tonight. There could be one even sitting next to you. I met a few myself. Their projects are going to be amazing. So they were celebrated, pinned, and certified earlier this evening. So congratulations to all of you. And of course, we are incredibly grateful that David Brooks is here. I've just taken to carrying the book around. I think Kara's reading the second or third time. That's how long it takes to absorb everything that we're going to hear about tonight. So with that and our Growing Home Fellows, I want to also welcome 3 individuals who were really part of the founders of the Foundation for Appalachian Ohio. And they're here tonight. Dean Schooler probably came the furthest from Colorado. Our own David Wilhelm and Tom Johnson. So I thank you as founders. As you may recall, as you have attended many ceremonies and gatherings of the Foundation for Appalachian Ohio, the candle, the legacy candle, carries a great deal of meaning for all of us. Tonight and every time we gather, we light this candle because it is your legacy and those who've gone before you, those who will come after you, who give to the foundation, and we always want to remember them. We light this candle for that purpose, and it is present at every one of our functions. Kara asked me if I would say a little bit about my upbringing in Gallipolis and Gallia County. Now, I had a little resume there, but it did not tell you that in 1964 I was named, crowned I should say, Miss Gallia County. Just saying. And the person standing behind my mother said, once the crown was bestowed, the ugliest one always gets it. And the worst of it is, I think that was my sister who said that. But anyway, I just want you to know that there are no words to say how proud I am of having grown up in Gallipolis. I've given a couple of commencement addresses at Rio Grande University, and I always use that little book, All I Ever Really Need to Know. I learned in kindergarten. I have totally replaced that with Gallipolis and my wonderful family and teachers and community friends and colleagues. It taught me so very much. I went on to do community work in the cities in which I have lived. Actually, David has written about one of them in Cincinnati, where we formed a cradle to career partnership to get more kids out of high school, into college, into career. We called this the theory of collective impact, that we are better together. And since then, I guess on my second mountain, David, I've been working in a nonprofit, just like FAO, to help universities work more effectively together. I think we're learning that we cannot do this by ourselves, and to do that work, we had to invent a word. I don't know if you know this, but John Colbert invented the word truthiness. I have no idea exactly what it means, but all the young people working around us thought it would be really clever if we invented the word systemness. And it simply means the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So the fact of the matter is, it's all right here in this book. I did not know that these were the building blocks that would bring me and many of my friends and colleagues and the people I grew up with to their second mountain. So it's a very, very meaningful point at which we gather tonight. I want particularly to thank the staff of the Foundation for Appalachian Ohio. Appalachian Ohio, I'm going to do both. I just feel equal time because they're spectacular. Could you have a round of applause for our wonderful. I'm only the opener and the closer, a person who runs the show, the inspiration for all of us, someone who found her second mountain probably sooner than most. For many of us, it has taken decades, but not for Kara Dingesbrook. We are so indebted and so inspired by Kara's leadership and her work. I turn the podium now over to you, Kara. Welcome.
Thank you, Nancy, and we truly, truly appreciate everyone being here. David, we're grateful you traveled to be with us. This has been a huge day to celebrate 121 Young Growing Home Fellows. They represent 30 of our 32 counties. They will be volunteering across our pillars of prosperity, and we really believe they are the cornerstone of our region's transformation. We're thrilled to witness that special event. We have several of our founders here tonight. You know, they've described FAO's start as an Amish barn raising. People showed up with what they had to give, they got to work, and a lot has changed over years, but not that. We remain a community of givers, donors and doers who are working to create opportunities in Appalachian Ohio. The Growing Home Fellowship is a perfect example of barn raising, the magic that comes from mixing and matching gifts of time, talent, and treasure. We especially want to thank our funders tonight, Governor Mike DeWine, Ken Taylor from Ohio CAT, and a very visionary anonymous donor who couldn't be with us, but she watches you every week, David, and is here in spirit. We're grateful for all here who have served on the Fellowship Selection Committee, those of you who have given time as a speaker, or those who will. I think I recruited a few more tonight for the leadership program. Those who are hosting local receptions. We're having 19 events this fall to introduce these local leaders to other community leaders. And those of you who have stepped forward as mentors and champions. All leaders need those in our court. So we thank you. You know, this fellowship is a pilot, but already we're seeing the difference it's going to make, and our goal is to have 1,000 Growing Home Fellows. We're off to a great start with these 124, and we really appreciate you being here at the very beginning. As I begin introducing David Brooks, I want to return to our founders and the way that they really set the stage for tonight. Nearly 24 years ago, FAO was started by leaders on the front lines of poverty relief, by public servants, and by visionaries like Dean Schooler and Tom Johnson and David Wilhelm. You know, they understood that people of Appalachia have the same potential as people anywhere, but we have not always had the same access to opportunity. They knew Appalachia would not gain socioeconomic parity without a new form of capacity. And we often talk about Appalachia's philanthropy gap, how we have 90% less assets per capita in grants and scholarships than the rest of the state. But our founders were not building on a gap. They were building on our region's second mountain ethos. We just didn't have those words for it yet. You know, we often say FAO exists to support acts of love. We call it philanthropy. You know, through booms to busts, neighbors helping neighbors is how we've survived. Our resiliency stems not from our independence, but from our interdependence, from our sense of community, our commitment to caring for our neighbors as we care for ourselves. You know, those outside of Appalachia sometimes overlook how connected we are. Our connections are built on faith, on family, on deep, abiding friendships that go back generations. They're built on our responsibility to care. What was significant about the creation of FAO is the way that our founders gave us a new way to organize our commitments and our neighborliness, a new vehicle we could use to leverage our existing generosity to advance greater and more sustainable impact. The thinking and the ethos and the moral ecology that David captured in the Second Mountain rings true to me, not only in my own life, but in what I witness in your acts of generosity, in the permanent joy that I see on your face when you come in to make a gift or when you give your time. I wanted David to come to speak to us because I feel like he's articulated what I see, the life and the opportunity-giving work that all of you are doing to unleash the potential of our region. And I was fortunate to meet David when he was finishing the Second Mountain, and this led to the opportunity to participate in a workshop at the Aspen Institute about the book and to hear his philosophy of community building. That was absolutely foundational to my development as a leader and to FAO's approach. And I'm just so thankful that now you all get the experience, especially those of you who are just beginning your fellowship journey, to hear from David. We are with a very special thinker and a very special person. David works as a columnist at the New York Times, a writer for The Atlantic, and a regular on PBS NewsHour. He also teaches at his alma mater, the University of Chicago. David co-founded and chairs Weave, the social fabric project at the Aspen Institute. He has taught at Yale and Duke, was a senior editor at the Weekly Standard, and held several posts at the Wall Street Journal and reported for the Washington Times. Works as the author of 5 books, most recently, The Second Mountain, and the forthcoming, which I'm glad we're going to hear about, due out October 24th, How to Know a Person, the art of seeing others deeply and being seen. David, we're so grateful you said yes to our invitation to come to Appalachian Ohio, and that you're giving so much of yourself to be with us this evening. Please join me in welcoming David Rose.
Thank you. So in 2017 or 2018, I started this thing called Weave. And our only job was to celebrate people who are building community. And so we traveled around for 4 or 5 years, just meeting people who are building community. We came to this part of Ohio. And we met amazingly inspirational people, like many of the people in the room tonight. But occasionally, you would meet somebody who was just a superstar. And I would say that happened in our travels in probably 49 states. We didn't get to Hawaii. It happened maybe less than 7 times, where you just meet somebody who is such a dynamic community leader, you just are blown away. And Kara was, for us, one of those 5 or 7 outstanding leaders. And so Akron has LeBron, but Logan has Kara. And it's fun and inspirational for me to be at the Foundation for Appalachian, for all that is happening here, for the fellows here. Thank you for investing in the next generation. And it's fun to watch a whole community come together and to watch the spirit of this community. Now, a community is a system of relationships. And to build relationships, you have to be good with people. And so you're looking at a person who is not naturally talented in this area. And so maybe some of you saw this movie, Fiddler on the Roof. And if you saw that movie, you know how huggy Jewish families can be, always singing and dancing and filled with emotion and just joy. Now, I come from the other kind of Jewish family. And so our phrase was, think Yiddish, act British. And so a super stiff upper lip. And I grew up in a neighborhood quite unlike this. I grew up in Lower Manhattan. And we were super left-wingers. My parents were kind of hippie-ish. And they would take me to a thing called a be-in the 60s. A be-in was where hippies would go just to be. And one of the things they did was they set a garbage can on fire and threw their wallets into it to demonstrate how little they cared about money and material things. And I was 5, and I saw a $5 bill on fire in the garbage can So I broke from the crowd, reached into the fire, grabbed the money, and ran away. And that sort of was my first step over to the right in my life. But still, I remained somewhat solitary. In nursery school, my teacher apparently told my parents, David doesn't play with the other kids, he just sits off to the side observing them. So not a bowl of fun. And then when I was 7, I read a book called Paddington the Bear and decided I wanted to become a writer, which is a solitary profession I've been doing pretty much ever since. And in high school, I wanted to date a woman named Bernice. She didn't want to date me, she wanted to date some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. And so that's where my values were. And then when I was 18, the admissions officers at Columbia, Wesleyan, and Brown decided I should go to the University of Chicago. And if you know anything about that school, the famous phrase about Chicago, it's where fun goes to die. But my favorite phrase, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. So very intellectual. The kids even to this day wear t-shirts that say, sure, it works in practice, but does it work in theory? And so very intellectual, up in your head. And I fit right in. I had a double major in history and celibacy while I was there at Chicago. And I actually, this is true, me and my roommate entered the Chicago Golden Gloves competition, and I was his manager, which is a boxing competition. He had never boxed a day in his life. But we decided to train the Chicago way. We didn't practice boxing, we just read a lot of books about boxing, which led to an illustrious 29-second career in the ring. And then if you'd met me out of college, I was probably, you would have thought I was cheerful enough, but a little inhibited, a little distant. And that sort of worked in journalism. I always say if you're at a football game and everybody's doing the wave and you don't do the wave, you just sit there, you have the right kind of aloof personality type to be a journalist. Because we don't do much, we just watch people. But I spent much of that life in my head. So I got a job as a conservative columnist at the New York Times, a job I likened to being the chief rabbi of Mecca, not a lot of company there, but sort of cerebral form of journalism. And then I'm on a TV show, which seems pretty social, but I'm on the most cerebral TV show on television called the PBS NewsHour. And we have long segments where we have long conversations, and we have a wonderful audience. It's someone seasoned. It's a seasoned audience. And so if a 93-year-old lady comes up to me in the airport, I know what she's going to say. I don't watch your program, but my mother loves it. And so that's like cerebral. Not great necessarily with people. And frankly, not great with emotion. I'm a big baseball fan, and I've been to thousands of games. I've never caught a foul ball. But I was in Baltimore about 10 years ago, and the batter loses control of the bat, it swings up in the air, and it lands in my lap in the stands. Now, getting a bat is 1,000 times better than getting a ball. And so any normal human being would be holding up his trophy, high-fiving everybody around him, hugging, dancing, getting on the Jumbotron. I put the bat on the ground and I just stood there and looked straight ahead. And I look back on that guy, it's like, show a little joy, like, show some emotion. But, eventually life tends to tenderize you and humanize you. Parenting is was an emotional revolution for me, had the public failures and humiliations. And then I started writing books on stuff that I really wanted to work on. A lot of us writers just work out our stuff in public. So I wrote a book about emotion, then I wrote a book about moral character called The Road to Character, and I learned while writing that book that writing a book on character doesn't give you good character, and even reading a book on character doesn't give you good character, but buying a book on character does give you good character, so I recommend that. And so then I wrote The Second Mountain, which was really about flourishing late in life, and now I've written this book, How to Know a Person. And I've learned over the course, especially over the last 15 years or so, that I'm not an exceptional person, but I am a grower. I do change. And I've worked on the stuff I was weakest at, and I came to realize that when you cut yourself off from your emotions, cut yourself off and protect yourself from the pain of the world, you're cutting yourself off from the holy source of life itself. And so I just wanted to become a more human person, and a more open person, and a person who would be better in relationship and better in community. And I have to tell you, it sort of worked. And I can prove it, but I have to do a little name dropping. So I've been interviewed twice in my life. I've been lucky enough to be interviewed by Oprah twice in my life, 4 years apart. And after the second interview, after the taping, she turns to me and says, you know, David, I've rarely seen anybody change so much in life. You were so emotionally blocked before. And so that was actually a good moment for me. Like, it shows no matter how old you are, you can still grow. And so I'm hopefully becoming a little more better at relationship, better at communication, better at community. But the sad truth is that I've been going on a journey toward being a little more human, I guess. A lot of people in our country have sadly been going in the other direction. And so we are in the middle, across this country, of some sort of social and relational crisis. And so you probably know depression rates are skyrocketing, suicide rates are up by a third. For teenagers, they're up by 60%. 36% of Americans report feeling lonely most of the time. 54% of Americans say that no one knows them well. The number of people who say they have no close personal friends has quadrupled since 2000. The share of Americans who rate themselves in the lowest happiness category is up by 50% over the last 20 years. So there's just been something going on which we're less good at relationships. And when you have people who are less good at relationships, they are sadder. And when they get sadder, they get meaner. Because if you think the world does not recognize you, the world does not see you, you regard that as an injustice, which it is, and you want to lash out. And so a lot of people have turned sad and mean, and the quality of a lot of our relationships, the quality of a lot of our communities has been under threat by really what is a spiritual, emotional, and relational crisis. And I can tell a lot of stories about why this has happened. I think social media plays a big role. I think sociology plays a role, not in this room, but around the country. A lot of people are less active in civic affairs. Maybe economic pain is part of what's happening. But I do think it is the sociological role would be the first story I would tell. Just that if you're not involved either in a church or in some community organization, suddenly you're not surrounded by a network of relationships to support you when things get tough. And so with Weave and coming out here and with what you guys are doing, we really spent a lot of time thinking, how can we get people more active in community organizations? How can we get people active in FAO and places like that? My favorite description of community organizations was written by a hero of mine, a woman named Jane Jacobs, who lived where I lived in Greenwich Village. And one day she was up on her second floor apartment, and she's looking out over the street, and there's a guy who's yanking on a 9-year-old girl, furious at her, and the girl is screaming. And so Jane Jacobs thinks, is this just a dad trying to pull his daughter, or is this like a kidnapping or something terrible? And so she decides she's going to sit there at the window and make sure something terrible is not happening. And as she's looking out the window on the street, she notices that the grocer has come out of his store. The locksmith is now walking down the street. There are a couple adults strolling toward this guy. And she realizes, she says to herself, this guy doesn't realize it, but he's surrounded. And what community is, it's a group of people looking out for each other. And she describes it as a ballet. In the morning, the trash guys come. Then the commuters are going. And then the parents are taking the kids to school. The street is a ballet. And a community is like that. It's everybody mixing together and dancing around each other, but looking out for each other. And as I've traveled around looking at the healthy communities, there are certain patterns that I see over and over again. First, those who stick. I was in Youngstown when we were doing our first trip, and there was just a guy in Youngstown with a sign at the town square and said, "Defend Youngstown." Other people were going to leave Youngstown, but he was going to stick. And communities are built by people who stick. Communities are built by understand that the neighborhood is the unit of change. A friend of mine says, you can't only clean the part of the swimming pool you're swimming in. You got to clean the whole pool. So you got to think about the region. You got to think about the town. You got to think about our collective environment. And community is built by that sort of thing. A technology for convening. How are we going to get people around a table? And I was part of an organization that a really extended family with about 40 kids. And we had dinner every Thursday night. And it was that Thursday night dinner that we did every single week of the year. We would just go around the table, talk about the high points, the low points, the struggles. Technology of convening to make it regular. Common stories. A community is a group of people who share a common story. I was in another part of Appalachia in Wilkes, North Carolina, and Lowe's Hardware was founded in Wilkes, part of NASCAR, a few big food companies, and they all left in the 90s. And so Wilkes went through their opioid crisis early. But they tell a common story. We had all these companies. We learned how to make things. They all went away, but we're still a community of makers, and we are going to make things again. And now the people in Wilkes have a shared common story about how we makers are going to keep building things. A common project. In the book of Genesis, the creation of the universe is described in 9 verses. In the book of Exodus, the creation of the tabernacle is described in hundreds of extremely boring verses. Why did they devote hundreds of verses to describing this one structure when the universe was 9? It's because Moses had to lead a fractious group of tribes and turn them into a community. And they needed a common project. And building the tabernacle was the common project that turned the tribes into one people. And so communities have a common project. They also have an ethos: we are enough. The neighborhood and the community is always enough. We have the expertise here. You might need outside resources, but communities do not need outside expertise. A spirit of radical hospitality. I have a friend who says, I practice aggressive friendship. I'm the person in the neighborhood who's inviting people over. I'm hosting the events. I practice aggressive friendship. The possibility conversation. It's easy to dwell on your problems, but having a conversation that dwells on your possibilities is the kind of thing that creates communities. And then finally, changing norms. What are the kinds of behaviors we take for granted? We were in Florida early in our travels, and we met a woman who was helping elementary school kids cross the street. And we go up to her and say, do you have time to volunteer in your neighborhood? And she said, no, I have no time to volunteer. We said, well, are you getting paid for this? And she said, no, I just help the kids cross the street after school. And we said, well, what do you do the rest of the day? And she said, well, on Thursdays I take food to the hospital so the people have some nice food. And we said, well, do you have time to volunteer? And she said, no, I have no time. To her, this wasn't volunteering, it was just what neighbors do. And if we could live in a society where just that was assumed, this is what neighbors do, we wouldn't have these relational crises. But then, the thing I focused on the last 4 years, and really the subject of this coming book, is that we talk about community, and I've used that word a lot. We talk about social connection. We talk about friendship. But these words are a little abstract. The things I'm describing here are really built minute by minute by a series of social practices. And the people who are good at building relationship, building community, building social connection, possess certain social skills. And they're skills just as particular and teachable as carpentry, as learning to play tennis. How to be a good listener. How to end conversations gracefully. How to sit with someone who's grieving. How to offer people criticism in a caring way. How to host a gathering where everybody feels embraced. And there's one skill that supersedes all these different skills that I think is the core of good relationship, good family, good organization, good community, good nation, and good society. That's the ability to accurately know a person, to make them feel seen, heard, and understood, to give them the gift of recognition. In my view, we all need these skills for practical reasons. If you're going to hire somebody, you have to know not just their technical skills, but who's generous with colleagues, who's comfortable with uncertainty, who's going to try hard in a crisis. You should know you should know this skill for generous reasons. As the teachers in this room know, when you see someone accurately, you create a new form of that person. If you see potential in me, I will learn to see potential in myself. We see ourselves as others see us. And there's something about seeing somebody with respect and reverence that brings forth growth. And finally, I think we need this skill just for national survival. I travel around this country as a journalist, and I see an epidemic of blindness. Black people feeling their daily experience is not understood by whites, rural people feeling unseen by coastal elites, Republicans and Democrats looking at each other in blind incomprehension, teenagers thinking no one knows them well, husband and wives in broken marriages thinking the person who should know me best has no clue. And so this skill has just seemed to me tremendously important. And so I ask you, how good are you at this skill of seeing and understanding others? Well, I've only met some of you, and some of you I've never met, but I can say this with a high degree of confidence. You're not as good as you think you are. There's a guy who studies this at the University of Texas. He finds that people understand each other, read each other accurately in their first conversation only 22% of the time. We're pretty ignorant of what the other person is thinking when we're in conversation. With friends and family, it's an average of 35% of the time. Some people are pretty good. They accurately understand what the other person is thinking 55% of the time. Some people are 0% of the time, but think they're 100% of the time. And so I've come to appreciate that in every group of people, there are some people who are really good, they're illuminators, and there are some people who are really bad, and I call them diminishers. Diminishers make people feel small and unseen. They stereotype, they label, they're just not curious about other people. Illuminators, on the other hand, have a persistent curiosity about people. They practice a skill and they make people feel bigger, respected, lit up. I read this biography of a novelist named Ian Foster, and the biographer wrote that engaging with Ian Foster, he wrote this: to speak to him was to be seduced by an inverse charisma, a sense of being listened to with such intensity that you had to be your most honest, sharpest, and best self. It would be great to be that guy. I read a story, this may be apocryphal, but it's often a story often told of Jenny Jerome, who would later go on to become Winston Churchill's mom. But when she was a young woman in England in the 19th century, she was invited and happened to be seated at dinner next to this guy named William Gladstone, who was prime minister. And she left that dinner thinking Gladstone was the cleverest person in England. And then a couple weeks later, she happened to be seated at dinner next to Gladstone's great political rival, a guy named Benjamin Disraeli. And she left that dinner thinking that she was the cleverest person in England. So it's nice to be Gladstone, it's better to be Disraeli. There was a famous labs named Bell Labs, which was a source of a lot of great technical innovation. And decades ago, they were trying to understand why some of the researchers at Bell Labs were super productive and some were less. And so they measured, like, are the super productive, innovative researchers, are they better educated? No. Higher IQ? No. They couldn't find any reason why some people were just more innovative than others. And then they noticed a pattern. The most innovative researchers were in the habit of having breakfast or lunch with an electrical engineer named Harry Nyquist. And Nyquist listened to them, got inside their heads, and helped them solve their problems. He was an illuminator. So how does one go about getting better? How do you get good at making people feel seen, heard, and understood? How do you get good at the building blocks of community? Well, the first part of this process is when we first meet each other. The first part of this process of building any relationship is that first encounter and that first gaze. When you meet somebody, unconsciously certain questions are going through their mind. Am I a person to you? Am I a priority to you? And the answers to those questions will be communicated in your eyes before any words come out of your mouth. So this was like 2 years ago, I was in Waco, Texas, and with our Weave project looking for community builders, and I was having breakfast at a diner with a woman named LaRue Dorsey, this 93-year-old lady who had been a teacher. And she impressed me sort of as a stern disciplinarian, a drill sergeant type. And she told me I loved my students enough to discipline them. And I was a little intimidated by her. She was tough. And into the diner comes a mutual friend of ours, a pastor named Jimmy Durrell. And Jimmy's probably in his 60s, a big roly-poly guy. He runs a great church. It's called Church Under the Bridge, where he serves the homeless under a highway overpass. And he goes up to our table, and he grabs Mrs. Dorsey by the shoulders and shakes her way harder than you should shake a 93-year-old. And he says to her, Mrs. Dorsey, you're the best, I love you, I love you. And that stern disciplinarian I had been talking to turned into a bright, eye-shining 9-year-old girl. And one of the lessons is be more like Jimmy and less like me. But that's only the superficial level, because Jimmy is a pastor. And so when Jimmy meets anybody, he's meeting somebody made in the image of God. When Jimmy meets anybody, he's looking a bit into the face of God. He's looking at a person who has an infinite soul. He's trying, by his calling and vocation, to look at them with the eyes of Jesus. How would Jesus look at this person? He's trying, and he's aware that this person, any person he meets, is so important that Jesus was willing to die for that person. Now, you could be an atheist, an agnostic, a Christian, a Jew, a Muslim, Buddhist, whatever. But looking at each person you meet with that level of reverence and respect is an absolute precondition for seeing them well. Because every person you meet is a never-to-be-repeated point of view, a creature of great creative power. So that's the gaze. The second process in getting to know someone is a word I borrowed called accompaniment. Most of life is just hanging out, going about your business. You're not having deep, soul-bearing conversations with each other. You're just hanging out. You're picking up your kids at school. It's a meeting at work. Accompaniment is an other-centered way of being in the everyday activities of life. Think of the way a pianist accompanies a singer. The pianist is not the center of attention. He's just attentive to the singer. He's trying to make her shine. Accompaniment is that other way of being. And some of accompaniment is play. I always try to include play in any conference I'm at, because when we're playing, we're most ourselves. And I play basketball horribly, but enthusiastically. And when we're playing, we're trash talking, we're high-fiving, we're moving around the court, we're passing, we're shooting, and we're just naturally ourselves. And play is a way for people to just be themselves. And play could be conversation late night at a bar, play could be basketball, play could be anything. Sometimes play is just a normal social occasion. I have two friends in Washington who say they love to have friends who are lingerable. If they're having dinner, the friends will linger for another hour or two, and they just love lingering with them. It's a great trait to be lingerable. But some of accompaniment is, in tired times, just showing up and practicing the art of presence. Again, you're not having deep conversations. You're just being there present. I had a friend who lost one daughter and then had another daughter suffer a terrible bike accident. And when she was ministering to the daughter who had suffered the bike accident, she was living with her for about 3 or 4 months. And she said to me, you know what was the best person who showed up for us during that period? Somebody came, hung around with us, went to the bathroom, and noticed we had no shower mat or no bath mat outside the shower. So they rode their bike to Target, they bought us a bath mat, and they put it in the bathroom, and they didn't say anything. That was the best act of service anybody did for us. It was just showing up. And that's an other-centered way of being. Sometimes it's more grave. I had a student at Yale named Jillian Sawyer whose dad died of pancreatic cancer. And as he was dying, they had the conversations about that he would probably miss the great milestones of her life, her wedding, graduation, other things. After he died, she was at a friend's wedding, and she was one of the bridesmaids. And she loved the wedding, but when it was time for the father-daughter dance, it hit her a little hard. So she decided she'd go into the bathroom, the ladies' room, and have a cry. And as she emerged from the ladies' room, all the people from her table and the next table over were just standing there in a line outside the ladies' room and just waiting for her to come out. And she gave me permission to quote from her paper she wrote to me describing that moment. What I will always remember is that no one said a word. Each person, including newer boyfriends who I knew less well, gave me a reaffirming hug and headed back to their table. No one lingered or awkwardly tried to validate my grief. They were there for me just for a moment, and it was exactly what I needed. That's a beautiful way of being sensitive to what the other person is going through, not overdoing it, just being present. But the key skill you need to get to know somebody really well is the skill of conversation. You can try to imagine what's going on in somebody's head, to understand what they're thinking, but you're probably going to be wrong. We're all too distinct. So how good are you at the skill of conversation? Well, again, I'll just tell you from my own experience. You're not as good as you think you are. Most of us are pretty good. You know, we've been doing it all our lives. But you want to be a great conversationalist to build a relationship, to build a friendship, to build a community, a great conversationalist. So I went around asking conversation experts, how can I be better at conversation? And I'm going to share with you a few of the tips they gave to me. 1, treat attention as an on-off switch, not a dimmer. If you're going to be in conversation, make it 100% or 0%, not 60%. Be a loud listener. I have a buddy, when you're talking to him, it's like you're preaching at some charismatic Pentecostal church. He's like, yep, gotcha, amen, preach, amen. Love talking to that guy. Make them authors, not witnesses. When people are telling you a story, they don't go into enough detail. So if you say, well, where was your boss sitting when she said that? Suddenly they're telling you a story, and they're giving you a rich description of what happened to them. Don't fear the pause. If we're having a conversation and my comment starts at my shoulder and I talk until the end of my fingertips, at what point have you stopped listening so you can think of what you're going to say next? Probably about here. Let me talk to my fingertips. And let it pause and then go. Don't be a topper. If somebody comes up to me and says, I'm having trouble with my teenage son, my instinct is to say, oh yeah, I know exactly what you're going through. I'm going through something with my teenage son. And it sounds like I'm just trying to relate, but what I'm really doing is saying, I don't really care about your problem, let me talk about my own. And so don't be a topper. Keep the gem statement in the center. When we're having a disagreement, there's probably something we agree upon. If my brother and I are disagreeing about our health care for our dad, we may be disagreeing about that, but we both want what's best for our dad. That's the gem statement. And if you're in the middle of a fight, you keep returning to the gem statement, you will preserve the relationship. And so these are just some of the tips that I think, they're easy life hacks to try to be a better conversationalist. But the key skill in being a good conversationalist is asking the right questions. The quality of your conversation depends on the quality of your questions. Now, kids are phenomenal question askers. Their job, somebody counted up, like every kid asks like 4,000 questions a year. My kids was like 4,000 a day. And so I have a friend named Naomi Way. He teaches 8th grade boys how to become journalists. And so the first time she ever did this, she sat in the front of the class and she said to him, okay, you shoot me questions, I'll answer honestly. And so first boy said, are you married? She said, no. Second boy said, are you divorced? Yes. Third boy said, do you still love him? Deep gasp of breath. Fourth boy, does he know? Do your kids know? By this time, she's crying. Very direct questions. But I think all of us, as adults, we get a little less good at it because we don't want to appear, we think we're being invasive or we don't want to appear dumb. And so I go to parties and I'll leave a party and I'll sometimes think, that whole time nobody asked me a question. And I now pay attention to this stuff, and I think about 30% of Americans are question askers. The other 70% are perfectly nice people. They're just not in the habit of asking you questions. And so I've really come to appreciate people who are good at questions. And good questions are storytelling questions. They invite a story. So as a journalist, I used to ask people, what's your view on this? Now my question is, tell me how you got your view on this. That invites them to tell me a story about the person who shaped their values or some experience they had. I read in this book by a woman named Kate Murphy called You're Not Listening, about a focus group leader who was hired by grocery stores to research why people go to the grocery stores late at night. And so she could have asked the focus group, why do you go to the grocery store late at night? But instead she asked a story-generating question, which was, tell me about the last time you went to the grocery store after 11 p.m. And one of the women who was in the back of the room who hadn't said anything in the focus group said, well, I smoked a joint and I wanted a menage a trois with me, Ben, and Jerry. And so you got some real insight out of that, or you learned about the person. And so the best questions after you've established trust, sometimes I had a conversation with a group of people in Texas I was visiting with, and I said, what's the most valuable, unimportant part of your life? And one guy started talking about how he loves trashy reality TV shows. I started talking about my Taylor Swift obsession. It was like a valuable, unimportant part of my life, but really got to know each other. Then when you get to know somebody well and you've established some trust, to me, my favorite kinds of questions are questions that lift people above their daily experience and they can see themselves from 30,000 feet. And these are questions like, what crossroads are you at? Most of us are at a life transition. What crossroads are you at? What would you do if you weren't afraid? I had a friend who was being interviewed for a job, and after the interview, he turned to the interviewer and he said, what would you do if you weren't afraid? And she started crying because she wouldn't be doing HR at that company. And I asked my students, yeah, what would you do if you weren't afraid? And every year, 2 or 3 say, I'd leave Yale. It's not the right school for me, but I need the prestige. I'm afraid to leave. So other questions are, if this 5 years is a chapter in your life, what's the chapter about? Can you be yourself where you are and still fit in? I had a great conversation with a group of people. How do your ancestors show up in your life? And some people were of Dutch background, some people were African American background. We all talked about how the cultures we came from influence how we are, and that's certainly very powerful in Appalachia. Peter Block is a community writer who has great questions. What is the no or refusal you keep postponing? What commitments have you made that you no longer believe in? What's the gift you currently hold in exile? And so these are just great kinds of conversations. But then, if you're going to see somebody in the hard moments of life, you have to have hard conversations. And that's really when you are there and having the important conversations. And so I had a friend was my oldest friend in the world, named Peter. And we met when we were 12, and we had known each other for life. And for the first 57 years, he was a very blessed man. He had a great family, he had a great job as a doctor, he had 2 wonderful boys, really a blessed life. And then at 57, he got hit by severe depression. And I have to say, I thought I was reasonably well educated. I had no idea really what depression was. I thought maybe you can extrapolate it from your moments of sadness and think, oh, depression's kind of like that. Depression is not like that. As a friend of mine wrote, depression is a malfunction in the instrument you use to determine reality. When depression hits, and especially for Peter and others, there are lying voices in your head telling you lies. No one would notice if you're gone, you're worthless. He had a storm of these kind of obsessive compulsive voices in his head. And so took me a while to really understand what it was he was going through. And it really took me a while to know how to have good conversations with him. In the beginning, and a lot of this happened over COVID, so it was just phone calls we were having, I tried to offer advice on what he could do to get out of depression. And I said, you used to go to Vietnam and you perform these surgeries and it really made you feel good. You should do that. And I've later learned that if you tell somebody who's suffering from depression, if you give them advice on how to get out of depression, all you're doing is showing them you don't understand what they're going through. Because it's not ideas they're lacking. The second thing I would do is try to remind him of all the joys of his life, what the psychologists call positive reframing. And I learned that if you do that, you're making it worse, because you're telling him he should be enjoying things he's palpably not enjoying. And so I had to learn that skill of how to have good conversations with my friend who was in a different state than I'd known him for the first 50 years of our relationship. After a while, I just learned a friend's job in these circumstances is not to cheer the person up, It's just to acknowledge the reality of the situation, stick with him, and reassure him you'll never go away, you're always going to be there. And that was a hard lesson. And I won't say it was a successful one. He ended up taking his life about a year and a half ago. But it was a lesson that I try to use that experience to at least share a little of what is learned, because a lot of us are now confronted and surrounded by people who have suffered from that kind of mental health problem. The other kind of hard conversation are the conversations we have in our bitterly divided society. And that's a conversation across difference, it's a conversation across inequality, and often it's a conversation laced with blame and attack and critique. And so if we're really going to see each other and show up for each other, we've got to be able to have those kind of hard conversations. And I've learned a few things from experts, not from me. First thing I've learned is every conversation that you have that's a hard conversation takes place at two levels. The top level is what we're nominally talking about, but the bottom level is the flow of emotions that are passing between us as we speak. With everything we say, we're either making each other feel safer or less safe, respected or less respected. And so we have to pay attention to that under conversation, which is the real conversation. The second thing I've learned is especially when somebody critiques me, my job is to stand in their standpoint. My first instinct when somebody critiques me about something is to say, well, I'm not the problem here, or you don't understand all the things I'm dealing with, or let me justify myself. But my first job is to really say, tell me more. And I found in most conversations, if there's difficulty, ask them 3 times, tell me more, what am I missing here? And if you do that, you may not persuade them, and you may not agree with them, but you will at least show respect for their point of view. The Scots have a term that you're ken. We know it, the phrase that's beyond my ken. The ken is a naval term, which was everything a sailor can see from where he is in the ocean. And so if you're talking to somebody who's critiquing you, who's attacking you, who's angry at you, who has a label for you, your first job is to stand in their ken. And that will show them at least respect. And there's a great book for people who want to learn more about these conversations called Crucial Conversations. And the authors of that book write, in every conversation, respect is like air. When it's present, nobody notices. When it's absent, it's all anybody can think about. So it's just to show that level of respect. And so this to me is how we build community. This to me is how we build morality. We think of morality as the kind of things that win you Nobel Peace Prize. But to me, being moral is just being considerate toward other people in the daily circumstance of life. It's just trying to see them with a just and loving attention. And I often ask people, tell me about the time you've been seen, where somebody really saw you. And often the stories they tell me are not super grand, they're every day. I had a woman who worked at a homeless shelter in early COVID. She got home from work. She was overwhelmed at work. She started weeping and hugging her dog. And her husband sits down next to her and says, here are the 6 chores I'm going to do while you're slammed at work. She said, that's all I needed. He understood what I was going through. He was going to lighten my load. I had a woman tell me about a time when she was 13 and she got her first taste of alcohol, and she got really drunk, and her friends dropped her off, and she was so drunk she was on the front porch and she couldn't move. And her strict, tall dad came out onto the front porch, and he saw her, and she thought he was going to scream at her for the thoughts that were already going through her own mind, which is, I'm bad, I'm bad. Instead, he just scooped her up in his arms, carried her, laid her down on the sofa inside, and just said, there will be no punishment here. You've had an experience. And she felt, wow, he really gets me. Again, not remarkable, kind of every day. I have a friend who was, his daughter was in 2nd grade, struggling a little in school. And the teacher said to her one day, you know, you're really good at thinking before you speak. And that one comment turned the whole girl's whole year around, because it took what she thought was a weakness, her social awkwardness, and it made it seem like a strength. And when I ask people about times they felt seen, for the fellows here, often it's teachers. And as I was hearing about that story, I was remembering me in 11th grade English. And I made some smart-ass comment in class, and my teacher, Mrs. Dewsnap, I can remember to this day, said, "David, you're trying to get by on glibness, stop it." On the one hand, I was humiliated because she called me out in front of the whole class. On the other hand, I thought, wow, she really knows me well. I'm so honored. And so I'll just conclude with a few moments of great seeing. One is from a movie I hope you'll all know called Good Will Hunting. And in this movie, if you remember the movie, Matt Damon plays this math whiz. And he has to, because of some difficulty with the law, go to a therapist played by Robin Williams. And in the middle of the therapy, the Matt Damon character makes fun of a painting that means a lot to Robin Williams that he painted. And the therapist is destroyed. He's like emotionally crushed. So he calls Damon out to a pond the next day, and he gives him this speech. "You're a tough kid. I ask you about war, and you'll probably throw Shakespeare at me, right? Once more into the breach, dear friends. But you've never been near one. You've never held your best friend's head in your lap and watched him gasp his last breath. I ask you about love, you probably quote me a sonnet. But you've never looked at a woman and been totally vulnerable, known someone who could level you with her eyes, feeling like God put an angel on earth just for you. I look at you, I don't see an intelligent, confident man. I see a cocky, scared kid. You're a genius, Will, no one denies that. But personally, I don't care about that, because I can't learn anything from you I can't read in a book. Unless you want to talk about you, who you are, then I'd be fascinated. But you don't want to do that, do you, sport, because you don't know what you would say." Now, this is a speech that comes from great listening, because the therapist has seen exactly the thing the Matt Damon character wants to hide the most, which is that he's scared. And he lays that thing on the table and says, "I see you, and it's going to be okay." And the second great beauty of that speech is that he says there are two kinds of knowledge. There's the kind of knowledge you get from books, which is great, but then there's the kind of personal knowledge you get from living a full life. And the Matt Damon character, is too scared to live. And so he's directing him toward a more personal knowledge. And that's really the kind of knowledge we need to see each other. I also read another account in a book I read about a year and a half ago called Lost and Found, a memoir by Catherine Schultz. And it's about the loss of her dad. And her dad was apparently one of these gregarious, wonderful guys. And she tells him, he had an opinion about everything, the infield fly rule, whether apple cobblers were better than apple crisp. Like, he was just apparently a fun-loving, glorious guy. But toward the end of his life, he just stopped talking. And he's in the hospital room or the hospice, near death. And one day, just before he died, the family decided to gather around him. And Schultz writes, "I had always regarded my family as close, so it was startling to realize how much closer we could get, how near we drew around his waning flames. And then that night, they decided they would each say the things they didn't want to leave unsaid." And Schultz described the scene. They went around the room, each one saying something. She writes, "My father, mute but seemingly alert, looked from one face to the next as we spoke, his brown eyes shining with tears. I had always hated to see him cry, and seldom did, but for once I was grateful. It gave me hope that for what may have been the last time in his life, and perhaps the most important, he understood. If nothing else, he knew that everywhere he looked that evening, he found himself where he had always been, with his family, the center of the circle, the source and subject of our abiding love." That was a guy who was seen. I just found her thing so moving. And if it's wonderful to be seen, I can tell you it's wonderful to be the seeing. It's just when you get somebody and really feel that connection, it's just so much fun. I was sitting, this was now 2 years ago, I was sitting at my dining room table at home in Washington, and I was reading a boring book, because that's what I get paid to do. And my wife walks in the front door, and she stands there in the doorway, and it's summer, and the light is coming in behind her, and she doesn't even notice I'm there, because that's the kind of charisma I have. And her eye happens to rest on an orchid that we keep on a table by the front door. And she's just absentmindedly looking at the orchid, thinking about something. And I look up from my book, and I see her, and I say to myself, these words come to my head, I know her. I really know her. I know her through and through. And if you had asked me what I knew about her, I wouldn't have said the personality traits she has. It wasn't the adjectives that I would use her to describe her to a friend. It was just sort of the ebb and flow of her being, the harmony of her music, the incandescence of her smile, the sometimes insecurities, the moments of fierceness sometimes. It was just the way she is. And it was almost as if I wasn't seeing her, I was seeing out from her. I was seeing the world as she sees it. And it was just a tremendous feeling of just connection with somebody you've obviously been through a lot with. And if you had asked me what word I would use to describe the way I saw her, the only word in English that came to mind was beholding. I wasn't inspecting her, I wasn't observing her, I was just beholding her. And it's a kind of, when you appreciate somebody and you just behold them with gratitude and a lot of pleasure. And I mentioned that to a friend of mine, and he said, that's what I do to my grandkids. I just behold them. And it's just at the end of all the skills, and when we really are committed to each other, when we're in a relationship, where we're in community, it's just a great amount of fun. Thanks for your attention.